Coming up, we're going to talk to a legal expert who specializes in Supreme Court matters. But first, we're joined by three members of Parliament. Erin O'Toole is the Conservative MP from Durham in Ontario and the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade. Peter Julian is the NDP MP for Burnaby, New Westminster in British Columbia. And Jeff Regan is the Liberal MP for Halifax West in Nova Scotia. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Thanks. So, Erin O'Toole, what's going on here with the Prime Minister and the Supreme Court and this issue of the phone call that either didn't take place or was refused? Why is the Prime Minister's office pointing this out to Canada?
Well, listen, I don't know about the phone calls in particular, but I think certainly when candidates were being found for the vacancy, there was lots of consultations. But once the final shortlist and once there was a special committee of parliamentarians, all party, I should add, the final list was chosen, and I think the Prime Minister's office then felt after that they should stop taking outside considerations. It's an approach that years ago was cloaked in secrecy. Our government's actually taken this and put it out in the open. We've now had in the last 3 or 4 appointments, I think, public consultations, and that's after the all-party committee reviews the final list of candidates, and there's consultations with bar associations, all these sorts of things, and then the final decision is the Justice Minister and the Prime Minister, and then that candidate is put before an all-party committee, and that's televised, and that happened with Mr. Nadon. But then there was a third-party challenge to his candidacy. So this one was very unusual. There's a lot more coverage of these issues now, Mark, because we've brought it out in the open, and that's led to, criticism of a choice or some people praising a choice. And I'm glad there's more consultation than there was under the Liberal government.
But this challenge came up, Peter Julian, because of something that the Chief Justice was pointing out, was Marc Nadon's eligibility, that might be an issue. Was there anything wrong with her raising that red flag for the Justice Minister and even potentially the Prime Minister?
Absolutely not. So instead of a process that's cloaked in secrecy, we now have a process that's cloaked in incompetence. And here, again, we have a situation where the Harper government just hasn't gone through a process that withstands legal scrutiny. We've had half a dozen cases over the last month where the Supreme Court, having looked at how the Harper government goes about doing its business, has had to say, I'm sorry, you just haven't followed the legal process that's set down or the constitutional process that's set down. So what I think is most disturbing about this is a pattern now we're seeing where the government screws up, and what they attempt to do is then denigrate people who call them on it. And we're seeing not just the Chief Justice, we saw this with Sheila Fraser, we've seen this with Marc Mirand, the Chief Electoral Officer, we've seen this as well with Kevin Page, the Parliamentary Budgetary Officer. In each case, this government has gone on the attack. It's almost like they're trying to distance themselves from being government and distancing themselves from the many mistakes they're making. It's simply unacceptable, and the Prime Minister should stop his attacks on the Chief Justice.
There's been no attack on the Prime Minister. Let's be clear. There's some confusion about phone calls and things like that, but there's been no attack on the Supreme Court.
Well, do you agree with that, Jeff Regan?
It sure seems like there's been an attack by the Prime Minister's office going after the Chief Justice, creating the suggestion that she had called when there was a court case going on. In fact, that's absolutely not the case. It's clear that the communication that she tried to make to the government was before the appointment was announced, to say, look, if you appoint someone from the federal court who doesn't live in Quebec, you could have a problem. And if they had listened to that advice, they wouldn't have been embarrassed. And moreover, Mr. Nadon, Judge Nadon, wouldn't have been embarrassed. If I were him, I think, knowing that in fact that advice had been given in advance, I'd be furious with this government for having put him through this.
There was a
quick response from you.
Mark, as you probably know, taking the politics out of this, the government obtained an opinion on the appointment from Professor Hogg, probably the foremost constitutional scholar in the country. We also had a former Supreme Court justice, so somebody retired from the bench, look at that opinion and concur with it. So there certainly was some people saying that the appointment worked. It was really an old law that precluded prominent Quebec jurists, but federal court jurists from being selected.
Isn't what's at issue here the fact that the Prime Minister's office is sort of sending a message to Canadians about the behavior of the Chief Justice? Isn't that what's at play here more than whether or not the appointment should have gone ahead?
I wouldn't say that's the case. I think there's discussion about when the consultations should go on and when they should end, and the final decision should be made by the executive and the government. But I think our system, you will always have a little to and fro between the judiciary and the legislative branch of government, and even more so now that we've brought this out in the open and we have more public consultations and public hearings on the candidates.
Very quickly, Peter
this is completely unprecedented. So it is simply not true to say this is just business as usual. To have the Prime Minister's office openly attacking the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is unprecedented and completely irresponsible. And what's more, the Supreme Court has been mostly appointed by Mr. Harper, and the decisions are going against the Harper government because they haven't done their due diligence. They haven't done their work properly, and it's because of that that they're losing in court, and often with the Speaker of the House of Commons. They just aren't doing their work effectively.
I have to jump in here because we've got other topics to get to, but I'll let you go first on this one, Jeff Regan. Do we need a temporary foreign workers program? Does it need to be scrapped? Does it need to be overhauled? What should happen with it?
It doesn't need to be scrapped. It does need to be overhauled. And in fact, it's only a few years ago that Minister Finley announced the government was increasing the size of it dramatically, making major changes. So the program we have today is dramatically different than it was about 5 or 6 years ago. The government has changed it a great deal. It's made a mess of it. And what it needs to do is to scale it back, but to get it right, to make sure that when labor market opinions are given, that they're accurate. There ought to be transparency, that people can see, in fact, when that's happening. But the way it's going is a mess, and what we're seeing across this country is that Canadian after Canadian has been losing their jobs because of this, and the government is ignoring it and only responding now when they've had an embarrassing phone call which came out in public, and that they're upset about what they're acting is to protect the Conservative Party, not the public.
So, Aaron O'Toole, what's the process going to be here for changes? Right now there's this moratorium, but at some point you're going to have to tune up this bill, this program, rather.
I think we've always committed to making sure that the program addresses fundamental shortages. It's got to be clear, Canadians know, Canadians are not going to be put in the back seat for jobs at all. This is only when labor market opinion dictate that there is a shortage, and those employers, to be productive, need that temporary help. But there's zero tolerance for abuse, and our reforms, Mark, actually started last year. So you're seeing those reforms in effect now. We can do inspections of workplaces. There can be a blacklisting if it is found that there was abuse, and we're now using those powers, and the moratorium comes because there were some cases in succession in the food services, limited to food services, where it seemed like there was some abuse taking place. The minister hit the pause button. These powers of inspection and review and the potential blacklisting will take place.
Okay.
And we're going to make sure that the program is there to help businesses that use it legitimately.
All right. Peter Julian?
It's only a partial stoppage in what has been a program that has been poorly administered and subject to abuse. So only partial.
So do you think it should be scrapped or just fixed?
No, we've always said in certain sectors it can be useful. The problem here is we're seeing in sector after sector abuses taking place. And what's suspicious to me, Mark, is that the government is steadfastly refusing to have the Auditor General come in and monitor the program so that Canadians can actually get the full bill of goods on what the government's doing wrong. Today we found out that in the manufacturing sector, since this government's come to power, the number of temporary foreign workers used has more than doubled. Now, this isn't a sector where 500,000 Canadians under the Conservatives have lost their jobs. So there's 500,000 ex-manufacturing workers that are out there unemployed. They could be employed in the manufacturing sector, and yet this government is permitting the manufacturing sector to double the number of temporary foreign workers it's using.
We're going to have to stop there, but thank you all for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.